I was actually living in West Oakland. I just moved to the Bay Area from Santa Barbara and had just entered the San Francisco Art Institute. And I was trying to sort of figure out what my move was, what my medium was going to be. I completely wanted to start fresh, and I was a performance art major, a sculpture major at the same time. And I got really involved in these charred wood Victorian homes that were just completely, almost literally burned to the ground because of drug addicts, inhabitants of crack cocaine sort of just took over the entire, basically ghetto neighborhoods across America. And these people just became incredibly addicted to this drug, and they would inhabit basically vacant Victorians in this old neighborhoods of Oakland, and I'm sure across the country, and especially in Detroit and other countries like that, other states like that. I just became fascinated, one, because I was always fascinated by architecture, and I had studied architecture in junior college and loved drawing architecture, and started realizing after learning about works from like Gordon Clark and people that were more into architectural deconstruction, that I realized that I could actually recreate installations and environments with this charred wood. So I actually started literally with my chainsaw and pry bars going through my neighborhood, tearing down burned down Victorians and stockpiling and itemizing each board in each wall section. And I got even to the point where I was actually dissecting these homes into like reworkable panels. So like if it was a 10-foot wall by 30-foot long, I'd cut 4-foot wide by 10-foot tall panels that I could stack on a truck, reinstall in the gallery museum, and then create an installation from that. Also felt like I wanted to pull the public into that, so I interviewed doctors at the Highland Hospital who were directly involved with the crack addicts, mothers, daughters, mothers and children, and basically did a survey on the repercussions of what the crack is actually doing in the community. And it was really alarming, and they were very emotional about it. And then I also interviewed the prostitutes and the drug addicts, and there was also a preacher that lived in the neighborhood that we also interviewed about his interpretation of what the crack epidemic was doing to West Oakland. I would collect from the floor syringes and human feces, and while I was tearing down homes, the crackheads would come in, smoke crack, shoot dope, and basically they were dealing with the drugs in their little balloons. So they'd ingest the balloon, they'd lean up against the wall, defecate it out, and then pick through their excrement to get their magical balloon with the drug in it. And basically it was very unhygienic. They didn't have water, so they would just basically contaminate their injection or their smoke with their feces, and it was just incredibly disgusting, and just that people were just so reduced to that, that they just needed to get high that bad. And so I sort of recorded that on some video, mostly still images, to realize how strong of addiction crack cocaine was for most people, and how it was just becoming more and more embedded in their culture and their society, and that it really was a major sort of pandemic, kind of a thing. So it propelled me to sort of express that to the art community through utilizing the indigenous properties and materials that were actually from that environment. So to place the viewer in the context of the environment as closely as possible, by debris, by interview, by actual structure from that environment. And it was sort of I think at that time it was a really sort of a new approach to art, bringing this sense of ghetto and debauchery and degradation of society into an art context where it wasn't just sort of taking photographs of it, it was actually really taking those materials out of that context and placing it in a fine art museum context. And I think in that sense it was really successful. Conceptually, it was exactly as the title mentions, that it was, two figures that I made out of probably like 25, 30 different bicycle frames that I just found discarded or in the trash cans or at thrift shops. And I would cut the bicycles up and made realistic human skeletons, male, female. And then I actually fabricated a life-size replica of what a swing set would be like, and propped them on a swing set, and then wrapped them in found objects, expanded metal, And then actually I stuffed them with dead fish newspaper and lit them on fire, so they swung as they were lit on fire, hence, swing set at ground zero. And then it was rumored that prior to the Terminator films, James Cameron and one of his art directors were interested in the project. Maybe were interested in purchasing it. I think a year later it was actually recreated in the intro to Terminator. Received a scholarship from San Francisco Art Institute and went up to San Francisco to fulfill that, and I got a studio in West Oakland. And while it was in West Oakland, I'd stuff the figures, light them on fire, and I actually had a large lot on the corner of San Pablo and Market Street where I'd activate the piece at night. And then from that, the rap artist, Too Short, was really interested in it, and actually ended up using it in one of his films. Days after his video premiered, the piece was actually stolen, and so it was kind of a sad ending. It was a big jump for me in terms of a solo show because I really got into object as metaphor and deconstructing Hollywood. And so basically, Same As It Ever was a title that I stole from the Talking Heads, but I put it in a completely different context because part of the project was to go through and deconstruct Hollywood, classic Hollywood films in terms of us desecrating and slaughtering the Native Americans to gain land and control over them. So I went through painstakingly every film I could find and took out scalping, maiming women, thrusting sabers through, children, and I sort of recreated a new film on that and sort of retold history. And I had to use the Calistoga wagon wheel as a symbol, so I took the Calistoga wagon wheel and I expanded them up to like 16 feet tall and had them wrap around and pull the open truss ceiling back down to the ground. And so really working with the architecture and creating a specific installation. And I think back then, not a whole lot of people were doing that, so it was really sort of a groundbreaking work for myself. Same As It Ever was sort of a jump for me in terms of merging architecture with installation, and to create the gargantuan Calistoga wagon wheel, 16 feet tall, and to have the viewer walk into that and feel like, diminished by, the grandeur of like the, John Ford, conquering the wild, wild west, or sort of placing them in effects of Manifest Destiny. And so I was using architect to tell yet another story. And then by appropriating all the films, I basically rewrote that story and placed history in a completely new context. It was a new way of making art to directly engage the viewer in the process of making art. The Lighthouse project was commissioned by On-Site Santa Cruz after the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake to create sculpture and public art and objects to bring everybody back to the downtown area of the decimated Santa Cruz, because after the earthquake, basically everything fell down in Santa Cruz and everybody ran away. It was just chaos. It was a mess. Mike Mandel and On-Site Santa Cruz got grants from NEA and Left Foundation, I believe, in San Francisco, and commissioned artists to build sculpture and installation to make downtown exciting again. And for me, I was still in art school. I was an undergraduate, and I was awarded this commission through applying for it. To like the final days, I had no idea what I was going to do. I was just so excited that I got the project. I was like, wow, what am I going to do? And I was living on my motorcycle at the time. And I was driving down for my initial meeting, and I still hadn't come up with my initial idea. And I was sitting in a little cafe drinking coffee and the little sugar cubes, little sugar packets. And I took a sugar packet out, and I was like going to put it in my coffee, and I was like, oh, lighthouse, beacon of hope. Wow, that's it. So I'm going to build a lighthouse downtown, right, off the shore, as a beacon of hope to draw people back to downtown. And this light would broadcast that it was safe. It was accepted with big praise. Wow, what a great idea. So what I did with the lighthouse was to build 3 stages of rear screen projection glass. And those were like bands of the lighthouse going up. It turns out one of the main contributors to the Hubble telescope lens lived in Santa Cruz and did an astronomy telescope night every night downtown. So he offered and actually built me a real lighthouse lens that actually went to the top, and we were able to project a 3-mile radius of downtown. So I took that 3-mile radius and went to the UC Santa Cruz there and hired their photo students and had them take portraiture of just everybody's face that lived in that 3-mile radius. And we projected those from the inside out on the lighthouse that revolved in the round. So as the spotlight and beam of light hit the public in the round, and a lot of them had balconies and they would come out and wave at the light. And as it hit them, you also saw them projected at the same time from the inside out of the lighthouse. And from a distance, the lighthouse sort of disappeared because it was a dark, really deep red with a lot of black in it. Just the bands of projection sort of floated, almost like flying saucers. So it's sort of a really eerie, sort of floating, effervescent kind of installation. It was a gas. I was still, enrolled in the Art Institute, and one of my instructors, Doug Hall at the time, was gracious enough to give me work study to build the lighthouse and still get school credit for it. And I came back, graduated after that, and it was still up. I think it was up all total for about 2 years or something like that. It was a temporary project. Really working with the community, really working in a public context in the community, and not really just trying to do my sculpture installed in their downtown area. It was really using something that was really about Santa Cruz, inspired by Santa Cruz, and functionally really what would really bring people back. And it really did. I got the most press out of that than I've ever gotten in my life, and it was just completely, became a political scapegoat. It became a giant red phallus for feminists. It became, I was a scab. I wasn't union. I was building this money that was, federal money, and it was just all these rumors started developing. I think it did what art was really supposed to, really create controversy and really create dialogue and contrast in the community. And I think it was really successful in that sense. It really was. I was asked to teach the same year I graduated, so it was sort of like, my friends were in my class and my fellow peers, and we had this new, group of students coming in. And so after talking with everybody, I thought the best thing that I could do was really throw everybody and immerse them into a context of conceiving a project, building a project, installing a project, and then actually showing a project. And so I took my class through all those stages into my studio, doing the architecture, and the piece itself was 2 large 16-foot tall wooden conal-shaped towers that had 2 large balloons made out of fabric that contracted and expanded. And as they expanded, we projected images of elderly people onto them. And why I did elderly people, I have no idea, but it just seemed at the time that I really liked all the wrinkles and just the texture in their faces, and it just worked with the balloons expanding and then contracting. And as it contracted, it just sort of draped down, and you just lost that image. And it was just sort of a nice architectural sort of gesture. And it was during a series I was doing of these illegal billboards off the freeways through the Bay Area. I brought my class into that and basically built these towers, and then built a wood structure encasing the viewer around, and then the back wall was a 16-foot by 20-foot tall rear projection screen that I hooked up a series of slide projectors that flashed probably up to like 1,000 images a minute of my drawings, and created this really wonderful new drawing of collage. It was a multimedia intense installation. And then in front of that, we had a DJ actually responded to that, playing his music. And it was just a really sort of a rave kind of installation project that I did with my class. I think they really grew from it, and they really realized that you actually have to do the work yourselves. I think there's a big myth with a lot of students versus, art, that they forget that you really have to actually do the work, kind of a thing. So, especially with installation art. The Majesty of Chaos was a huge leap for me. It's a very prestigious residency awarded to only several people a year in San Francisco, California. It was founded by Anne Hatch. It was just amazing that I was even awarded the residency. I think I was like 29 or 30 years old when I got it, which is really young to be able to do something like that. It was the first real budget that I really had to make my work. Again, I went into a lot of historical reference and referencing history, and during that time, I sort of had exhausted the slide projectors. I had been using a lot of slide projectors because video was just sort of coming into age, and we didn't have digital video yet, and I was trying to keep separate from, the video icons like, Bill Viola and Namjoon Pike, and Bruce Nauman, and I sort of wanted to sort of tweak it a little bit and say, here I am with slide projectors. And so I borrowed and on loan and wherever I could get one, I got almost 50 slide projectors at one point. And I basically built this Foucault, voyeuristic sort of prison Big Brother kind of column with all these slots in the round of the column. Then I projected out and created this arena, coliseum in and around that. And as the viewer walked in, you saw paneling, and the paneling was split. And then it went up to a soffit all the way to the ceiling. So I completely took over the entire downstairs floor. And I think it was like 40 by 60 feet, and created this installation that the viewer walked in sort of in awe, admiring the architecture, and then all of a sudden on a time of the whole lighting of the whole house, it just completely went to black. And then the slide projectors dissolved on and created this imagery in the round. And then to really work with that three-dimensionality, I made large 5-foot diameter wheels that were propped up on a wall that sort of ran around the perimeter of this whole installation. So there were 3 wheels running constantly around. And as the wheel ran around, when the slide projector hit the wheel, it sort of pulled the image off the projection screen and took that with it. Promotion to Glory was a lot of fun. I was coming down off of the Cap Street project, the Majesty of Chaos, and at that time I was really into appropriating imagery. One, because I was really difficult to get funding for the work I was doing. There just wasn't a budget for it. And so I started going to the local Blockbuster and video rental chains and just grabbing what I could, coming back to my little studio and stealing whatever imagery I could find. And Promotion to Glory, I think I went through about 400 probably, segments of tape, if not more, to get the classic dogfight scenes. And what I wanted to do was sort of bring war home to America. It was sort of a prophecy, premonition that I had, that I was sort of convincing everybody that we are going to invade Iraq. We are going to do it. We're going to bomb the shit out of them, and there's nothing we can do about it. And I want you to feel the same way that the Iraqi people feel. So I started doing these large-scale billboards off the freeways in San Francisco, and dyed the videos that I edited to a sepia tone so they sort of matched the twilight sky. So the billboard almost disappeared when the video turned on. It turned on by an automatic timer, and sort of jets were coming out of nowhere, and sort of like confronting the viewer. And I had a high volume soundtrack. The high volume soundtrack, I think, really increased the reality of what it would be like to live underneath that sort of war monster. These warplanes flying overhead all night and the bombs going off. I really felt that we were just taking war for granted, and like what it actually really does. And for me, it was a way to talk about our embargo on Iraq at the time, and like actually, get people to start thinking about what embargoes really are. We basically starved 1 million children to death in Iraq, from that embargo. White Lead was a project that I did realizing the effects of media violence through Hollywood, and then I also took it into like video gaming. And so I did the same process where I took probably even more, every like B film, A, whatever you could imagine that had to deal with gun and sexual violence. And I basically cut those apart and just took out the gore and guts out of it and created an 11-minute film out of that and projected that. And it was another sort of premonitional piece that I was working on, because the whole study that I was working on for 3 years prior to that with the jets and with the gun violence was that what were the long-term effects on our youth, and basically, what is this doing to our youth? It's just ridiculous. For me making the film, I actually got really sick. I actually, like, after 3 months of being locked in my dark room, editing room, of just looking at all this violence, I actually started getting incredibly ill and realized what the implications were. And then, ironically, 3 or 4 days before I think actually a couple days before my actual opening to actually show the piece to the public, my phone machine was almost blowing up from all the calls I was getting, because the Columbine massacre actually happened. So everybody was really abashed at like, wow, how did you know this? Did you have any part in this or anything like that? And then years later, Michael Moore makes the Bowling for Columbine. And so I think it was like, that work for me was really influential and, a broader context than just the art world. I was sort of me stepping out from the art world, not as an outsider, but me using that knowledge and trying to share more with the general public, what artists can really convey to the general public, that we're not just making art, for art's sake kind of a thing. Not that I'm really religious in any sort of that kind of a sense in any way, in terms of organized religion or Western religion, but it was something that I was just like really compelled to really work on after doing the gun violence piece. It was just like watching all this death and just all this like just complete waste of life. An art patron commissioned me. I roughed out the idea. I wrote a small script, and he commissioned me to say, okay, let's do it. Let's go out to the middle of the desert. Let's crucify him. Let's do all this. So I basically recreated these 3 scenarios out in the middle of the desert. So we actually had him come back. Jesus came back for 2000 in the white robe and the blonde hair. And I really wanted to bring people out to the desert, and I really wanted to work with that environment, because my experience in the desert, that I would spend a lot of time, that was like my vacation spot to get away from the art world and just sort of go out and live in the desert for a while and camp and hike. And there's a real purity there. It's really appalling, like how many of our soldiers are actually killed by friendly fire. And I think the estimates are like beyond 60%. And it was just overwhelming to just think that here we are, this great country, this great army, defending democracy, spreading democracy, defending America from terrorism. I don't know where that was going, but I had to say something about it in that context. So what I did was to take raw meat, liver, guts, blood, and all that, and basically pound it into these Xerox drawings I was making of mercenaries, because I think our armies have become privatized and they've just gone way beyond traditional armies. We sign up for it. We're actually paying our soldiers as mercenaries to go and fight our wars, and it's completely ridiculous. So I wanted to respond to that, and so I made these traditional Xerox drawings, again, no budget, that I cut up images of mercenaries, and I blew their legs apart, and I used raw meat, sausage and beef and pork, and sewed it onto the drawings themselves as almost collages. And then a friend of mine happened at the same time, it was just sort of fun, where she found a video, an actual video of friendly fire. So we're actually shooting this Gatling gun from our atmosphere, and it just blows up like 10 of our American soldiers, and body parts are flying around like crazy. So I used that as a projection behind us to tell the story. And then in front of us, I brought back into life a stuffed animal costume that I was doing in San Francisco, where I stuffed animal guy, where a sort of a giant cape and headdress that I made out of like hundreds of stuffed animals that I found in thrift shops and things like that, to sort of play with the sentimentality of the child losing his, father in war, wife losing, sort of, like, let's make the kid happy. Here's a little stuffed animal kind of a thing. So I was playing with like a lot of different realities that way. So we take the drawings, its process from the pristine white gallery walls presentation, and bring them onto my butcher block and pound raw meat and guts into these drawings and mache them, and also spraying the audience with little bits of this, and sort of giving the audience something to take home with them, which in reality, I got calls days later where people were finding like meat chunks and blood and things coming off of their coat. And one woman was actually out to dinner after my show, and basically a piece of liver like fell into her soup. It was just, it was like disgusting. And so I think that really says what the show was about. Sort of conceived of this piece as I was a Alaskan musher on a sled coming back home to my wife, and I had been hunting, and this massive storm developed, and it just got more and more Armageddon chaos storm, and I just never really got to her. And Sander, the title came from, instead of having reindeer or dogs pull my sled, I used electric belt sanders. So the belt sanders were actually pulling my sled towards my wife Sandy, and Sandy was on this green platform tending to the baby sanders, waiting for my arrival with the food, and the baby sanders, were like basically the small husky dogs that were going to pull the next sled. A spoof on that, just sort of a bizarre little performance installation that I don't think I ever really finished. Like, I really wanted to have more time and go into it and really create it as a real installation piece, performance, but it was sort of a one-liner, kind of a, no budget, let's get it done in a couple days and you have a show. Democracy Coming to Your Town Soon was a really fun piece because I had just moved to Ventura from San Francisco, and I felt like it was a lot more conservative, a lot more military, Christian kind of influence for me, and I felt a little awkward because I felt like I had already sort of come to terms with that with myself, and I felt like a lot of people that I met there really hadn't come to terms with, like, you know, really accepting other forms of religion or other realities other than war. And I was sort of war economy, you know, economy based on war, and I was sort of intrigued by, well, here we are celebrating 4th of July every year, and we have a fair and we eat hot dogs and we light off firecrackers, but what does that really do in terms of honoring our vets or honoring what we really did, basically slaughtering and maiming children in other countries? So I used the billboard videos where I brought war to the viewer in a gallery museum context. So I not only bombarded the gallery viewer with fighter jets and explosions, but then I also wanted to honor and place the context of Betty Crocker, Miss America, in front of that. So serving up democracy. One of the main collaborators I work with, Caitlin Jane Peterson, was there serving hot dogs with buns, ketchup, and mustard to the viewer. So it just sort of placed the viewer in almost uncomfortable context with a high volume soundtrack and eating the hot dog, watching these warplanes coming at them with explosions and terror. I really wanted to go into politics, but I felt like there was really not an audience for it, and I didn't really want to get too deep into it. I don't feel like I ever really finished the piece. Like, I'd really like to take it further and like really do more of it. And basically Bad Artist was me running back and forth as a target between two ends of a gallery and drawing with both hands on each end, creating a mural on both sides, but then trying to get back to the other side of the gallery without getting pelted by real baseballs. Playing on the idea that an artist can basically sort of has to go through this like rite of passage of sort of beating on himself or herself, or sort of like rites of like getting their demeanor or their like sort of like personality that defines them in terms of spectacle in society, and sort of like, are you like tenured, are you sultry, or have you been through enough to like say that you can like really comment on these things in general as an artist? And so I was just playing with all those sort of issues of like sort of like tempering an artist, and then also taunting him. Also the element of food, where with Sweet Meat, I got, you know, I used food in a traditional sense, performance art sense, where I mashed it, I used it as an art material, and blood and guts defined what I was trying to say. Well, this time I really wanted to use the food as something that was edible and not wasted. And so I cooked shish kebabs while they were taking breaks or pelting with baseballs. So I was using the food element when you're at a baseball game and the hot dogs are frying and shish kebabs and all that, and sort of, you know, playing with other senses, you know. And so it was my first piece to like really use food as a sensual element, you know, and sort of like to really serve it back to the viewer. A lot of times you go to an art show or a performance and you digest it, and you go home and you're thinking about it that night and the next morning, and then you sort of forget about it. Well, this was like, okay, you're not only doing that, but you're also ingesting it. So you're going to wake up in the middle of the night or in the morning and go, God, that was, you know, amazing. I ate that, you know. So I actually ate that art. Bad Artist 2 was sort of an impromptu. I had just come down from that show, and Michael Beeler, executive producer at Caps TV, Channel 6 in Ventura, was excited about the work and wanted me to do something in their studio. And again, there was no budget, it was last minute. So I sort of took the drawing element, and because there was no budget and it was just entirely too hot in the studio to wear the stuffed animal thing, I found new stuffed animals in thrift shops and had Caitlin and Friday on the floor wrapping them in bondage and tying them with rope and little faces on them, and each one they wrapped, they hung around my neck as I drew this mural. And so you could imagine after about like 10 or 15 animals around my neck, it began to strangle me and I couldn't breathe. And part of my drawing was interpreting these wrapped, mummified animals that I was like drawing their portraits and then also drawing what else sort of came to me at the time. So it was like a spontaneous sort of reactionary piece. At the end, after we ran out of animals, we basically sort of got into this completely like aggressive bashing of me and strangling of me, and it got to the point where I almost lost consciousness and they had to cut him off my neck and the piece was done. And so again, it was just a place where I felt like just being abused. I just sort of wanted to be abused, have other people abuse me, rather than like be an artist abusing myself from sleep deprivation or overworking or things like that are more traditionally abusing the artist. I was sort of playing on claustrophobia, and I was sort of playing on the idea of the traditional housewife having a very voyeuristic, altruistic dream based on her cooking the same meal every night for the same man in the same house and cooking chicken. And it was sort of like her escaping that reality and going into sort of a dream. And we went from the traditional suburbia home cooking, frying chicken to out in the jungle wilderness of her sort of being free, running through the jungle, and then discovering Pandora's box, this glass box floating out in the middle of this jungle that she inhabits, falls asleep, and in a dream state, a floating chicken inhabits the box. And from her hunger and vulnerability, she starts devouring this floating, mysterious chicken. And then because of her fulfillment and saturation, she sort of falls back into a dreamscape and dreams back into reality. And so how do you do that as a performance? So I sort of wanted the viewer to see the big, epic film that we made. And I took over a nursery and rearranged the entire nursery to create a jungle and built this box. And we filmed her in this nursery fake jungle, and then projected that as part of the installation. And then the two boxes that I brought back into the installation were her century sort of spirit guides, alter reality sort of things. I used Miracle Whip frosting and covered the boxes because I wanted to sort of use the censorship of the media and the conservative reality telling her that she can't dream, that she just needs to be a housewife and make dinner and not have her own freedom. Wicker Mythology was really fun. It was a piece where I felt really, really comfortable, and it came to me in a dream. And the dream vision was me running through a field as shaman, and I was running through the field, and when I realized it in my arms, I was holding a dead woman. At the end of that vision, at the end of the field, running and running and running, I actually brought her back to life. And then through that, realizing that dream, I realized that for some reason I was chosen because she really wasn't dead, and I was the one that brought her back to life. So I wanted to recreate that in a reality and place the viewer in that context. For me, it felt like a jump in my work because I was able to really combine multiple projections and multiple films cut into like one reel that we actually projected for the performance, and to actually get a mortuary that would let me use the real coffin and stage a funeral and run in and steal the young girl out of her coffin and run outside the mortuary and then go into a nature setting and basically anoint her and turn her into female shaman and come back into my studio and then be able to build in my big props and really direct the final shot was like a process that was like really wonderful to work in, because most of the time you're showing in a gallery or museum and you can't really do that, So to be able to come into your studio and use it as not only a theater but actually as a production studio at the same time, and then turn that around and create that as the installation performance, and then have the viewers come into your space and see the project. It was really a fascinating way to work. It turned this sort of Frankensteinian thing of bringing somebody back to life, and to mix the food with that, and sort of like a ritual process, engaging the audience in not only the smell but the confrontation of being that close to the actions that were like really happening on stage, and then also taking the imagery into account and having it completely in the round. So they were not only surrounded by imagery, they were surrounded by the cooking of food, they were surrounded by the spectacle of performance set directly in front of the audience, were two women mixing bowls of raw meat. that I had marinated. And they were mixing bowls of raw meat, so the audience right away got the scent of marinated raw meat. And physically, underneath the stage, I had secret ropes, and I was pulling them back towards me as they mixed the meat, as the installation went on. And to the right of the front of the stage, I had created this giant boar who I was sort of playing on the themes of Vishnu and going down into the earth and turning himself into a boar and saving Mother Earth from drowning and coming back up. And that's the conception of the earth. And on top of the boar, I had a trumpet player who was with a spear guarding the meat. And as the meat finally got back to me, which I was propped up on a stage where I built an Egyptian 26-foot tall funerary boat as a prop, and then standing in that boat, actually holding the entire boat up, was the moon goddess, who was actually cooking with lightsabers that I built, cooking simultaneous tri-tip roasts on barbecues, symbolizing, the nurturing of Mother Earth, feeding. So we not only saw the moon goddess cooking the ceremonial food. As I pulled the ceremonial meat back to me, I was actually cooking the meat behind her, and she was glowing white like the moon. And then above me was the sarcophagus, sort of glass box that was the young woman who was resurrected and come back to life. And as the performance went on, I was climbing up to proverbial ladder, feeding her with the raw meat and nourishing her back to life. Live sound was like myself chanting that was pre-recorded, that was then broadcast out. And part of a sound element was really exciting that I had never done before, is that I cut a bass guitar in half and stretched the bass strings up 16 feet tall to the top of a wall, and then actually played that with the spear, and that became like the main focal sound element in the installation, in the performance. So it was a multi-visceral, multi-narrative, sort of just completely chaotic bombardment of all the senses to the viewer. Umberto Eco wrote this book called Foucault's Pendulum, and it was all about each individual. There's always an individual that's like really becomes possessed and enamored by the spectacle going on, and who's going to inherit that sort of realm of spirit and nature conveyed by the act of the spectacle happening. And it always happens to somebody. So to pinpoint that is a little ridiculous, but every performance that I've been doing, somebody always sort of gets possessed by that spirit. So I'm asking this question: is this the process of making art, or is this a process of performing a ceremony, or is it a process of just creating spectacle, waiting for the victim